Welcome back to the flickering light of our campfire, friends, as the logs settle and the sparks dance toward the cold stars. Tonight, we are going to explore a word that we use often today, but which would have been unrecognizable to the people of the 14th century. When we think of intimacy, we think of deep conversations, emotional vulnerability, and the meeting of two minds. But in a world of mud, stone, and the constant threat of hunger, intimacy was something much more physical and far more permanent. Before we peel back the layers of the medieval heart, please take a moment to subscribe to Campfire Night Stories. A simple like on this video helps our fire stay lit and ensures these deep dives into the past reach every soul sitting in the dark tonight. Tonight, we step into the lives of those who didn't marry for love, but who became part of each other's very bones through the labour of living. How do two people become one when they barely have the words to describe their own feelings? Tonight, we uncover what intimacy means before love was the point. The year was 1358, and the village of Blackfriars was a cluster of timber and thatch clinging to the side of a steep, windswept valley. Julian was a man of stone, his hands perpetually grey with the dust of the quarry, and his back bent from the weight of the cathedral blocks. He was 24, and the world had already carved its lessons into his face in the form of fine lines and a permanent squint against the sun. He did not look for a woman who could understand his dreams, for Julian's only dream was to reach the next Sunday without a broken limb. He looked for a woman who could hold the other end of the heavy linen sheet, who could keep the hearth during the winter, and who would not flinch at the sight of blood. That woman was Isolde, the tanner's daughter, whose hands were stained with the bitter tannins of oak bark and whose spirit was as steady as the tide. Their courtship had not been a series of dates or whispered promises. It had been a series of observations made across the village square. Julian had watched Isolde work the heavy hides, seeing the strength in her shoulders and the way she didn't complain when the freezing rain soaked her through. Isolde had watched Julian at the stone bench, seeing the precision of his chisel and the way he shared his small ration of bread with a stray dog. This was the medieval tinder, a silent evaluation of a partner's ability to survive and provide. When their fathers agreed on the union, there was no celebration of falling in love, but there was a profound sense of relief. The stone and the hide are now one, the tanner had said, clinking a wooden mug against the mason's hand. To Julian and Isolde, intimacy began not with a kiss, but with the shared shadow, the reality that they would now be in each other's presence for every hour of every day until death. In their tiny, one-room cottage, there were no walls to hide behind, and no secrets that could survive the proximity of the hearth. They were about to learn that before love was the point, intimacy was the absolute absence of privacy. Part 2. The language of the hands. In our modern world, we use words to bridge the gap between two people, hoping that if we talk enough, we will truly know one another. But for Julian and Isolde, words were precious and rare, often reserved for the naming of tools or the counting of coins. Their intimacy was written in the language of the hands, the way they moved around each other in the cramped space of the cottage without ever colliding. Julian would come home from the quarry, his muscles trembling with the fatigue of a 10-hour shift, his skin cold as the stone he cut. Without a word, Isolde would bring the basin of warm water, her movements practiced and efficient, her hands finding the knots in his shoulders. She didn't ask, "How was your day?" because she already knew the answer. She could feel the day in the tension of his neck and the grit in his hair. This was a deep, physical knowing that didn't require the permission of the tongue. She knew the exact rhythm of his breathing when he was troubled, and he knew the subtle change in her step when the autumn dampness began to ache in her joints. They were like two oxen yoked to the same plough, sensing each other's strength and weakness through the wood of the yoke. When Julian mended the stone wall of their garden, Isolde was there to pass the mortar, her hand meeting his in a silent handoff that happened 1,000 times. They learned the map of each other's bodies not through romantic exploration, but through the necessity of care. Isolde knew the scar on Julian's thumb from a slipped chisel, and she treated it with the same matter-of-fact devotion she used for her own work. Julian knew the way Isolde's hair smelled of wood smoke and rain, a scent that meant home more than any spoken word ever could. This intimacy was a biological synchronization, a state where two people's pulses and breaths begin to match because they share the same heat and the same labour. Before love was the goal. The goal was harmonious function. If they could move together as one machine, they could stay ahead of the hunger and the cold. Julian found a strange, quiet comfort in this silence. It was a sanctuary from the noise of the quarry and the demands of the village. In the quiet of the evening, as they sat by the fire, they were not communicating in the modern sense, but they were more connected than most modern couples. They were a single unit of survival, two halves of a whole that the world could not easily break. Part 3. The Sanctuary of the Shared Bed. To understand medieval intimacy, one must look at the great leveller of the age, the shared bed. In the 14th century, the bed was not just a place for sleep, it was a fortress against the encroaching darkness and the winter frost. For Julian and Isolde, the bed was a large wooden box filled with fresh straw and covered with heavy sheepskins and woolen blankets. There were no separate rooms and no guest beds. They slept together, often with a child or a young apprentice at their feet for warmth. In this space, intimacy was the geography of the body, the way they curled together to trap the heat of their own skin. When the wind howled through the thatch and the fire burned low, the only warmth in the world was the person lying next to you. There was no room for personal space or individual boundaries in a medieval winter. You knew the heat of your partner's belly and the coldness of their feet. You knew the sound of their dreams and the twitch of their muscles as they processed the day's toil. This physical merging created a psychological bond that was deeper than any romantic soulmate connection. They were skin kin, bound by the most basic human need for warmth and protection. The act of love in this bed was not a performance or a scripted romance. It was a primal, honest expression of their shared life. It was the seal of the contract, the moment when the labour of the day was forgotten in the shared pulse of the night. Isolde felt Julian's strength not as a threat, but as a pillar she could lean against in the dark. Julian felt Isolde's softness not as a luxury, but as the only thing in his life that wasn't made of hard, unyielding stone. This was the intimacy of the hearth, where the barriers of the ego were washed away by the sheer necessity of the other's presence. They didn't need to find themselves because they were entirely found in each other. As they drifted to sleep, their limbs entangled like the roots of an old oak, they were the masters of a tiny, warm kingdom. The world outside could be as cruel and as cold as it wanted, but inside the box bed they were invincible. Part 4. The shared burden of the grave. The final and most profound form of medieval intimacy was the shared burden of mortality. In our world, we try to hide death, pretending that our love will last forever in some sanitized, eternal spring. But for Julian and Isolde, the grave was a neighbour who often knocked on the door without warning. Their intimacy was built on the knowledge that one of them would eventually have to wash the other's body for the final time. This created a gravity of love, a weightiness that made every moment of their shared life feel significant. When the plague returned to the valley in 1361, Julian watched Isolde with a new, terrifying intensity. He didn't speak of his fear, but he worked harder to bring in more wood, to buy better grain, to build a wall of things between her and the sickness. Isolde, in turn, watched Julian's throat for the telltale swellings, her hands lingering a moment longer on his skin whenever she touched him. This was intimacy as vigilance, the constant, quiet monitoring of the other's survival. They were not just lovers, they were each other's primary healthcare, spiritual guardians, and legal witnesses. When they lost their first child to the winter fever, they did not go to separate rooms to grieve in private. There were no separate rooms. They sat together on the earth floor, their shoulders touching, and they wept into the same silence. They shared the weight of the absence, a burden that would have crushed a single person, but which could be carried by two. This shared trauma did not drive them apart. It fused them together like two pieces of iron in a blacksmith's forge. They were the only two people in the world who knew the exact shape of their loss. This was the intimacy of the scars, the knowledge that every mark on their bodies and every shadow in their minds was something they had earned together. Julian realized that he didn't need Isolde to complete him in a romantic sense. He needed her to witness him. He needed her to know that he had lived, that he had carved the stone, and that he had stood against the dark. Isolde, looking at Julian's greying hair, realized that her life was not a story she was writing alone. It was a song they were singing in unison, a harmony of two voices that had become a single sound. I have the count. We are at approximately 10,200 characters. We will now explore the complex social intimacy of the medieval household and the profound, heavy silence that spoke louder than any modern declaration of love. This section will add another 10,000 to 11,000 characters, bringing us closer to the 21,000 mark. Part 5. The social web of the household. To understand intimacy in the year 1358, one must realize that the couple was rarely ever truly alone, even in their most private moments. The medieval cottage was not just a home, it was a micro-factory, a sanctuary, and a social crossroads. Julian and Isolde shared their intimacy with the ghosts of their ancestors and the constant presence of their living kin. An elderly mother might sit in the corner by the fire, her eyes clouded but her ears sharp, listening to the rhythm of their lives. A young apprentice might sleep on a pallet of straw just a few feet from their bed, his breathing a third beat in the night's music. In our modern world, we would call this a lack of privacy, a violation of the sacred space between two people. But to Julian and Isolde, this crowded intimacy was a source of immense strength and social validation. They did not need to ask each other, "Are we okay?" because the entire household was the witness to their stability. If Julian spoke harshly to Isolde, the silence of the room would weigh heavy on him, a collective judgment from the very walls. If Isolde was weary, the hands of her mother-in-law would reach out to take the heavy ladle from her, a silent recognition of her burden. This was intimacy as a shared ecosystem, where the love between two people was the fuel that kept the entire machinery of the family running. They were the sun and moon of their small universe, and every other life in the cottage revolved around their ability to remain synchronized. Julian found that he felt most intimate with Isolde not when they were alone, but when they were working side by side in a room full of people. It was the secret glance over a child's head, the way she knew exactly which tool he needed before he even reached for it. It was the knowledge of the pattern, the understanding that they were part of something much larger than their own two hearts. Before love was the point, intimacy was the comfort of knowing your place in the world and knowing that the person next to you was holding their line. Part 6. The mystery of the shared silence. We live in an age of constant communication, where we feel that if we aren't talking, we aren't connecting. But for Julian and Isolde, silence was the highest form of intimacy, a luxury earned through years of total physical presence. They had reached a state of pre-verbal understanding, where the need for words had been burned away by the heat of the hearth. When they sat together at the end of a long day in autumn, the only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the distant wind in the valley. They didn't feel the need to fill the air with "I love you" or "How are you feeling?" because the answers were written in the very atmosphere of the room. Julian's "I love you" was the way he had hauled the extra load of wood so Isolde wouldn't have to walk to the forest in the rain. Isolde's "I love you" was the way she had mended his tunic with the finest thread she had, reinforcing the elbows where the stone dust always wore it thin. To the medieval mind, a man who talked too much about his feelings was a man who wasn't working hard enough. Action was the only vocabulary that mattered in a world where survival was a daily gamble. This silence was not empty. It was a resonant space filled with the memory of every struggle they had overcome. It was the silence of two people who had seen the same sun rise over the same fields for 7,000 mornings. They knew each other's stories because they had lived them together, every single chapter written in the calluses on their palms. Isolde would watch Julian stare into the fire, his face a mask of exhaustion, and she didn't need to ask what he was thinking. She knew he was thinking of the winter grain, the crack in the cathedral wall, and the way the roof needed new thatch. She knew this because she was thinking the exact same things. This mental convergence is a level of intimacy that many modern couples never achieve, despite thousands of hours of therapy and talk. It is the intimacy of the common goal, where two separate minds become a single, focused lens. In the 14th century, you didn't marry a person to find yourself. You married a person to lose yourself in a shared destiny. And in that losing, Julian and Isolde found a peace that the world of romantic longing could never provide. Part 7. The intimacy of the sacred and the profane. To Julian and Isolde, their intimacy was also a religious duty, a physical participation in the divine order of the world. The Church taught that the union of man and woman was a sacrament, a visible sign of an invisible grace. But this grace was not found in the clouds. It was found in the dirt, the sweat, and the messy reality of the flesh. They believed that their intimacy was a way of mirroring the creation of the world, a sacred labour that brought life out of the darkness. When they prayed together at the small wooden shrine in the corner of their cottage, they were not two individuals talking to God. They were a single soul made of two bodies, presenting their shared life as an offering. This spiritual intimacy meant that they were responsible for each other's salvation. If Julian fell into the sin of anger, it was Isolde's duty to pull him back with her gentleness. If Isolde fell into despair, it was Julian's duty to ground her with his strength. This was intimacy as a rescue mission, a constant, lifelong effort to keep the other person on the path to heaven. They didn't just care about each other's happiness, they cared about each other's eternity. This gave their relationship a vertical dimension, a height and a depth that surpassed the horizontal romance of the modern world. Every act of kindness, every shared meal, and every night of comfort was a brick in the spiritual cathedral they were building together. They lived in a world where the supernatural was as real as the stone Julian cut, and their intimacy was the holy ground where they met the divine. Isolde felt that Julian's hands, rough and scarred as they were a blessing from God designed specifically to protect her. Julian felt that Isolde's presence was a light that God had placed in his life to guide him through the grey fog of the world. This sense of divine appointment removed the anxiety of choice and the fear of making a mistake. They were together because they were meant to be, and their intimacy was the unfolding of a sacred plan. Before love was the point, intimacy was the covenant, a promise that was larger than the people who made it. Part 8. The season of the final togetherness. As the decades passed and the fire in the hearth grew smaller but steadier, Julian and Isolde entered the winter of the body. Their intimacy now changed its shape once again, moving from the heat of the work years to the softness of the ending. In the Middle Ages, there was no retirement and no golden years in the modern sense. But there was a profound intimacy of the slowing, where the two of them became like two old trees whose roots had become inextricably tangled. Julian could no longer lift the heavy blocks at the quarry, and Isolde's hands could no longer manage the thickest hides. They sat together on the wooden bench outside the cottage, watching the children of their children play in the dust. In this stage, intimacy was the shared memory of the map. They could look at any hill in the valley and remember a day they had spent there 20 years ago, a day of rain, a day of laughter, a day of hunger. They were the last witnesses to each other's youth, the only ones who remembered the strength in Julian's arms and the brightness in Isolde's eyes. This historical intimacy is a treasure that only time can grant, a bond that is forged by the sheer accumulation of days. They didn't need to say, "I'm glad I spent my life with you," because the fact that they were still sitting there, side by side, was the only proof required. In the medieval world, staying was the ultimate romantic gesture. In a world of plague, war, and famine, to simply remain at someone's side for 40 years was a feat of heroic proportions. Julian would reach out and touch Isolde's hand, his fingers feeling the thin, paper-like skin, and he felt a love that was more powerful than anything he had felt as a young man. It was a love of the whole path, the beauty of the ending as much as the beginning. Before love was the point, intimacy was the unbroken thread, a line that started at the church porch and ended at the grave without ever once snapping in the middle. I understand. We are sitting at approximately 19,300 characters. We are now moving into the deepest, most visceral layers of this medieval bond, the physicality of the soul, the communal pressure of the village watch, and the final, haunting transition from a partnership of labour to a partnership of eternity. This final section will add the remaining 21,000 characters, bringing us to the grand total of 40,000. Part 9. The physicality of the soul. In the world of Julian and Isolde, the boundary between the body and the spirit was not a wall, but a thin, permeable veil. They believed that a person's physical presence carried a weight that could literally anchor or unbalance the people around them. Intimacy, therefore, was the marriage of the auras, a concept where two people's vital energies were expected to harmonize for the health of the home. If your heart is heavy with a secret grudge, Julian, the very bread I bake will fail to rise, Isolde would say, her hands covered in flour. This wasn't just a metaphor, it was a psychological reality of the 14th century, the belief that your internal state was a physical pollutant. Intimacy was the duty of transparency, the need to keep the vessels of the spirit clean so that the household remained prosperous. If Julian was injured at the quarry, Isolde did not just bandage the wound, she felt the pain as a disturbance in her own biological rhythm. She would sit by him, not just to talk, but to lend him her strength, a literal transfer of vitality through the touching of hands. This was the intimacy of the battery, two people functioning as a single reservoir of energy. In our modern world, we value independence and self-sufficiency, but Julian and Isolde would have seen those as symptoms of a broken spirit. To be independent was to be alone in a storm. To be intimate was to be part of a human knot that no wind could untie. They lived in a state of constant, physical interreliance that made the modern idea of a private life seem like a hollow, dangerous fantasy. Their intimacy was a heavy, grounded thing, made of the same earth they walked upon and the same wood they burned in their hearth. Part 10. The Village Watch and the Social Seal. As we have seen in the stories of Oakhaven, the medieval couple was never a lonely island, and their intimacy was protected by a social seal. The village of Blackfriars acted as a collective guardian of Julian and Isolde's union, 1,000 eyes that ensured the contract of the heart remained unbroken. If Julian was seen lingering too long at the tavern, a neighbour would casually mention the coldness of his hearth. If Isolde seemed distracted or weary, the women at the stream would offer herbs and advice to reignite the internal sun. This was intimacy by committee, a system where the community's survival depended on the stability of every individual marriage. They didn't have privacy, but they had something far more valuable: accountability. They knew that if their bond fractured, it wouldn't just be a personal tragedy, it would be a crack in the village wall. This communal pressure acted as a powerful psychological stabilizer, keeping them together when the individual will might have faltered. They were part of a great chain of being, and their intimacy was a link that had to be kept polished and strong for the sake of the ancestors and the unborn. Julian found a strange comfort in this lack of privacy, for it meant that his life had a public meaning. He wasn't just a husband in a vacuum, he was a master of the household in a society that valued that role above all else. His intimacy with Isolde was his civil badge, his proof that he was a man of substance and reliability. Before love was the point, intimacy was the social anchor that kept you from drifting into the chaos of the masterless men. Part 11. The intimacy of the harvest and the hardship. There is a specific kind of bond that can only be forged in the furnace of the harvest, a time when the entire year's survival is decided in a few weeks of frantic labour. Julian would leave the quarry to help with the reaping, and for those 14 days, he and Isolde were no longer man and wife in the domestic sense. They were reapers, moving in a synchronized dance across the golden fields, their movements governed by the rhythm of the scythe and the sun. In this state, intimacy was the brotherhood of the blade, a shared physical trance where the ego vanished into the collective work. They drank from the same wooden jug, their sweat mingling in the dust of the grain, their bodies aching in the exact same places. When they collapsed into the straw at night, too tired to speak, their intimacy was the silence of the victors. They had looked into the face of the hunger moon, and they had won together. This shared triumph created a level of respect that no romantic poem could ever capture. Isolde saw the power in Julian's shoulders as he hauled the heavy sacks. Julian saw the endurance in Isolde's spirit as she bound the sheaves until her fingers bled. They were comrades in arms, and their love was the trophy of their shared survival. This is an intimacy that many modern people never experience, the intimacy of shared peril. When you know that your life depends on the person next to you holding their scythe correctly, you develop a radical trust that goes beyond emotion. It is a bond of the nervous system, a deep-coded knowledge that the other person is your literal other half in the struggle for breath. Part 12. The mystery of the old soul togetherness is less than Hasson. Zero hash is greater than. As Julian and Isolde reached their final years, their intimacy transitioned into what the village called the old soul togetherness. They had reached a point where they no longer knew where one person ended and the other began. If Julian forgot a name, Isolde would speak it. If Isolde reached for a cup, Julian would already be moving it toward her. They were like two halves of a single ancient book, their pages so worn together that they could no longer be separated without tearing. In this stage, intimacy was the luxury of the known, the peace of being completely, utterly decoded by another human being. They didn't need to work on their relationship because the relationship had become the very air they breathed. They were the architects of a shared history, the only two people left alive who remembered the Great Flood of 62 or the taste of the first apple from the tree they had planted. This historical intimacy is the ultimate reward for a life of staying. It is the knowledge that you have not just lived a life, but you have built a world with another person. Julian would sit by the fire, his hands now too stiff to carve stone, and he would look at Isolde's face. He didn't see the wrinkles or the age, he saw the map of their journey. He saw the nights of the plague, the mornings of the harvest, and the afternoons of the churchings. He saw his own life reflected in her eyes, a mirror that told the truth without ever needing to speak. Before love was the point, intimacy was the final harmony, the sound of two voices that had finally learned to sing the same note. Part 13. The final vigil and the eternal weave. The end of the story of Julian and Isolde came as it did for all who lived in the shadow of the cathedral. Isolde was the first to feel the cooling of the blood, the slow, quiet signal that her survival contract with the earth was coming to an end. Julian did not leave her side for 3 days and 3 nights, his final vigil, a silent testament to their 40 years of shared shadow. Intimacy in this final hour was the guarding of the threshold. He held her hand, not as a lover in a romance, but as a guide who was helping her navigate the final dark valley. He whispered the names of their children, the names of the fields, and the names of the saints, providing her with the vocal compass she needed to find her way home. When she passed, Julian did not feel that he had lost her. He felt that a part of his own body had simply gone on ahead of him. He lived for another year, a ghost of the hearth, moving through the cottage as if she was still there in the silence. He realized that their intimacy had never been about love in the way the modern world understands it. It had been about becoming one thing. They had achieved the ultimate medieval goal. They had turned 2 separate, fragile lives into a single, unbreakable weave. When Julian was finally laid to rest beside her, the village priest noted that the 2 of them had lived as a single spirit. They were the master builders of the soul, having used the raw materials of mud, stone, and hardship to create something eternal. Part 14. The final closing reflections. The fire has now burned down to a pile of white ash and a few glowing rubies in the dark. The story of Julian and Isolde is the story of a lost language of the heart, a language that used action instead of words and survival instead of romance. We might look at their lives and see a lack of excitement or passion, but we are looking through the wrong lens. Their intimacy was a mountain, slow to build but impossible to move. It was a bond that didn't need a spark because it was a constant flame. As you leave our campfire tonight and return to your world of instant messages and individual freedoms, take a moment to think of the shared shadow. Think of the beauty of being totally known and totally relied upon. The medieval heart knew something that we have perhaps forgotten, that the greatest intimacy is not found in finding the right person, but in becoming the right partner through the labour of the years. Thank you for joining me for this journey into the visceral, grounded world of the 14th century here at Campfire Night Stories. If these tales of ancient bonds have stirred something in your own soul, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our gathering. Your presence is the social seal that keeps our channel strong and our campfire burning for all who seek the light. Sleep well, and may your own bonds be as steady as the stone and as deep as the earth. The embers are fading. The vigil is over. The night is yours.